Good afternoon all and welcome to this latest Eurostat webinar. I'm Tim Allen, I'm the Deputy Head of Unit for Dissemination and User Relations and I'll be your moderator today. I have three of my colleagues with me to present labour market statistics. I'll introduce them one by one as their presentations come up. But first I'd like to just do a little bit of housekeeping. We're collecting your questions via Slido. And the code is on screen at the moment, 560331, and a QR code. So if you put your questions, any questions you may have there, we will feed them through to the panel at the end to see if they can answer them for you. We're also recording this session so that if you have to leave halfway through, or you think your friends and family might like to watch this instead of the latest episode of their favourite soap opera, you can show it to them afterwards. It will be putting it on our website and making it available through our Facebook page. Okay, so I'd like to start. This is a webinar on the labour market and the labour market in 2021, and as we all realise, the last 2 years have been something quite unusual for the labour market. So first of all, I'm going to introduce Didier Dupré, who is the Head of Unit for the Labour Market and Lifelong Learning at Eurostat. So over to you, Didier.
So good afternoon. And also welcome from my side to this webinar, and as just mentioned by Tim Allen, which is a webinar on the labour market statistics and focusing in particular of the evolution in 2021. Tim mentioned evolutions and the situation particularly specific in the last years in the labour market, and more generally, of course, it's a key socioeconomic statistical domain. So this is why, of course, it's important to present you this result. The data that will be presented come from the European Union Labour Force Survey, which is the largest European household sample survey. And it is dedicated to the situation of people on the labour market as regard the different situation in the labour market. The survey is quarterly, but today we will focus on annual data as we have now all the information for the year 2021. Indeed, the data for the last quarter 2021 was already available and published mid-April, and based on that, the full annual data was now published yesterday, and we are also publishing in these days a series of articles to complement the analysis. As we said, 21 was still a year when the labour market was impacted by the COVID crisis, in particular at the beginning of the year, while later it showed already important signs of recovery, and this will be presented into detail. And of course, we can compare 2021 with the previous years, 2020, which was the year of the full impact of the COVID crisis, 2019, which was somehow the pre-COVID situation, so the most comparable if we return to normal, and longer time series and trends. My colleagues, they will be introduced by Tim Allen, so I don't do it, but they will present you two different presentations. The first one will give an overview of the situation of employment, unemployment, and people outside the labour force, as well as the differences in the evolutions for men and women. The presentation will also give some methodological information and some other insights in the results. And the second presentation will be focused on the labour market situation of young people in the EU and the impact of the COVID crisis on them. We will also in this presentation provide information for some countries and also an overview of the situation at regional level. And of course, in both presentations, we will also tell you shortly where to find the data in the Eurostat website. So that's it from my side, and I would like to give back the floor to Tim, and in order to have the different presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Didier. So I will start by introducing the first presentation and the first speaker. This is Hannah Kiva, a statistical officer in the labour market and lifelong learning team at Eurostat, and she's going to give the general presentation on labour market evolution in 2021. So over to you, Hannah. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you very much for the introduction, Tim and Didier. For my presentation, as already mentioned, I'll focus on the most important labour market indicators during the last years. Then I'll spend a couple of minutes looking at methodological changes we've had in the past year, and related to these changes, also I'll give you an overview of how to access the data and what to use for which type of analysis. And then, of course, after me, my colleague Fabienne will give you the really good stuff, the more detailed analysis for young people. But first of all, a quick look at the employment rate, one of our most important indicators, and also labor market slack for the EU overall. In this slide, you're looking at the time series since 2009, and you see that from around 2013, after the debt crisis, we've had an increase in the employment rate. It's the dark blue line with the dots, right up to 2020, when we had the COVID measures impacting the labor market, and you see a massive drop in the employment rate. We do have a longer time series, and I can tell you that since we started these series, we've never seen a drop like this. So this was quite impressive. And what you also see then from this second quarter of 2020, we've had almost immediately a recovery of the employment rate. And with the second quarter of 2021, we see a good increase of the employment rate each quarter. And right now, in the fourth quarter of 21, we are actually higher than before the COVID crisis, so higher than the values in 2019, showing that there are indications that the labor market has recovered quite well at this point. The other indicator in this slide is the labor market slack. It's a broader measure of unmet need for employment. It contains unemployment, which is the best known indicator of this compound indicator. It's a somewhat lighter blue bars, which are the unemployment, but it also contains data on the underemployed part-time workers. So these are people who are employed, but they would like to work more hours. And also people who are out of the labor force, but they're very close to our definition of unemployment. So they are available for work, but not searching for work actively. These are the yellow bars. And then these very short light blue ones all the way on top are those who are searching for work but are not immediately available. But all of those together still want to work. They have an unmet need for employment. And what we see there is sort of the mirror image of what we have seen in the employment rate. We had a nice trend downwards until the COVID crisis hit, an immediate jump, again, a jump we haven't seen before in this indicator. And then it has triggered off, and now we're back to levels before the impact of the COVID measures. So overall, it's looking good. In the next slide, we have a look at the employment rates now for men and women separately. This is important because possibly you remember at the beginning of the crisis and the measures, we had schools closed, we had daycare centers closed, and the hypothesis was that all this extra care work in households would fall mainly on women, or to a larger degree on women, and that it was quite possible that they would suffer more under these measures. And a look at the employment rates, at least for the EU, on average shows that we don't really see any evidence of that in the employment rates. They both dropped approximately same effect, 2.1 percentage points for men, 1.8 percentage points for women from the first quarter of 20 to the second quarter of 2020, and then both recovered more or less in parallel. So this is, of course, a rather broad measure of labor market success, let's say, and conditions. So in the next slide, we're looking at one dimension of job quality, specifically the temporary contracts employment rate. You see that before the crisis, this indicator was really close together for men and women. So the same share of the population was working with temporary contracts. And then those this share dropped between the first quarter and the second quarter of 2020. And the explanation for this is quite easy. These were the people who could easily be, well, not fired because their contracts probably ended. They were just not rehired, so they weren't given a new contract. So the drop here was 1.1 percentage points for women and 1 percentage point for men, and that's a half or more than a half of the overall drop in the employment rate. So this group took a massive hit, clearly. And now after the crisis, we see that this share has recovered well for women. It's going up and it's higher than for men. This is in one way, it's good because it means people are restarting the jobs. But in another way, you see that the share now is higher for women. And given that women have the lower employment rate, it shows that women have slightly lower quality of employment in comparison. Now we have a look at unemployment in the next slide. And I'm waiting for the next slide. I'm already going to tell you about it. We have, again, the breakdown for men and women. And we see that typically women had larger shares of or higher unemployment rates. This hasn't really changed in the crisis. It went up, both went up a little bit later than the employment rate went down. And I remember there were a lot of questions on this. Why isn't unemployment going up? We should see a much larger increase. But we know what happened is that a lot of subsidies went out to firms to try to keep people employed. And so we never saw this massive peak in unemployment as we've, for example, seen it in the US. And so after this peak in the unemployment rate, we can see that conditions improved quite well over time, and they have dropped to a level which now is even back at the lowest. We've seen it in 2020 Q1. And when we're talking about unemployment or all of these indicators, do keep in mind that what we're looking at here are EU averages, of course. So if in your country it's different, that's of course quite possible. These EU figures are heavily driven by the development in the large countries. So developments in Germany, in France, Italy, Spain, and Poland. And of course, also in these countries, the individual developments will vary to some extent. Another interesting dimension of unemployment is always to look at the long-term unemployment rates. In the next slide, we will see that those people who have been unemployed for 12 months or more, they had a bit of a different development. And at first glance, this might seem a little counterintuitive. Why would they drop so much in a crisis? But if you think about what unemployment means, it means that people are out of work, they want to work, they're looking actively for a job and are available to do that job. You see that in the second quarter of 2020, those who were already unemployed for a long time, they just stopped looking for a job because clearly at this point we saw people couldn't even go to work. So for someone who had already been unable to find a job, it did make sense not to keep looking. And we saw immediately, once it was possible to go back on the labor market, that this figure rebounded and has been growing strongly in the time between the third quarter 2020 up to the third quarter 21. This makes sense because, of course, it takes some time for someone to be counted as long-term unemployed. So the search behavior had to be thus that we could capture this longer duration of unemployment. And now it's going down again, which in this case now can really be interpreted as a good sign that these people are actually finding jobs rather than that they stop looking for a job. All right, that leaves us with a final group, which are those who are completely out of the labor market. So they're neither employed nor unemployed. And what we see here, it matches, it's the exact mirror image of employment. We see a relatively stable value and then a large increase, a large jump. Again, it's the largest jump we've seen in this indicator. And then an immediate recovery, and now actually an all-time low of the share of persons outside the labor force. What is noticeable is that we still have a large difference here, a large gap between the share of men and women, and it has been relatively stable. So also here we cannot really see a particular impact on women versus men from this crisis. All right, so now before looking at these and other indicators in more detail for the young, who are important and vulnerable group in the labor market, I would like to comment on some methodological developments we've had in the last year. So next slide, please. All right, as Didier already mentioned, all the data we're presenting today is derived from the EU Labor Force Survey, so I'll not comment more on that. What we are always striving for, of course, is to keep this survey as relevant as possible. So we are trying to capture developments in the labor market that happen over time, and so regulations that govern this data collection need to be updated once in a while. This has happened in 2021. We've, for the first time, started to collect data under new regulation. And the purpose of this regulation was not only to update certain labor market concepts, but most importantly, to increase the harmonization, the way data is comparable between countries. The drawback of changing definitions and methodologies, even if it means that the quality improves, is that we risk to have a break in the time series, so the comparability over time. To avoid that, we've taken our most important indicators and we've applied some break corrections, of course, together with the member states who collect the data. And we have information on the new methodology as well as on the break correction exercise under the link, which is now going to be posted in Slido. And I have a screenshot on the next slide, so you can see what you can find there. It's one of our Statistics Explained pages. It contains a good overview of the methodology of the labor force survey. You can find the current methodology, you can find the past methodology, and under the fourth point, you will find all the information on the breaks in time series and how they were corrected and which data you can find online without the break. Since it's not always extremely easy to find the right data, on the next slide, a short overview on how we disseminate the data series. On the website, in our data tree, you can find detailed survey results from the LFS series. You'll see it in a minute also on a screenshot. And if you want to look at the data in a lot of detail for small age groups, for several breakdowns, this is where you have to be. So it contains the most detailed indicators we publish directly. In the same general folder on the LFS, you will also find something called LFS main indicators. There's one folder, and in this folder you will find the main results from 2009 on, what we just presented, which are data which are broader, so larger age groups, less detail, less breakdowns, but they will include estimates for past data, correction of the main breaks, and seasonally adjusted data for the quarterly series. And these are all duplicated. We have the same main results until 2020 with the same seasonal adjustment and estimates for past data. And these are still based on the old methodology, and they are under the historical tables in the LFS main indicator. So depending on what kind of analysis you want to do, you should pick wisely which one of these series you use. For example, for employment, if you want to look at a very small age group, just the 10-year age groups, you probably it's best to go with the detailed results. If you want to look at data, at current data without a break in 2021, you should look at the main indicators, the current ones. And if you want to discuss the financial crisis and you want longer time series, you should look at the main results until 2020, so our historical main indicators. In the next slide, you see how this looks on our website. You have the LFS main indicators folder open, so you see the the current data and the historical data folders, and below the detailed quarterly and annual survey results, just so you know where to find what. All this information, because it was quite quick now, is also contained in our information note. You can find it right next to the main folder. It's marked in yellow here in this slide. So this is a summary and repetition of the info I just gave. All right, then after this somewhat dry information, I hand over now back to Tim and then Fabienne for interesting analysis of young people. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Yes, so this year is the European Year of Youth, and it's particularly appropriate that we we take a look at the labour market impact on young people and the labour market impact of COVID on young people. So I will present Fabienne Montagne, who is the team leader of the Labour Force Survey and Lifelong Learning methodology and analysis, and she will talk to you about labour market statistics with a focus on young people. So over to you, Fabienne.
Okay, so thank you, Tim, and good afternoon to everyone. So in this presentation, as just Tim mentioned, I will show the particular situation of the young people on the labor market, and especially in this context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So maybe you know that the European Union with the member states has set up a series of initiatives to improve the situation of the young people. And this year is dedicated to the youth. So 2022 is the European Year of Youth. In this context, the young people are defined as people aged 15-29. So this is why in all my presentation, I will refer to this specific age group. So next slide, please. So I start here with a general comparison of the situation of the young people as regards the labor market in comparison with the total population. So as it was also the case in the presentation of Anna, the general population is defined as the age group 2064 because it's the reference age group for the European Union in terms of employment target. So I take this age group as the reference, And so here in the graph at the left side, you can see what is the repartition of the population age 2064 in terms of labor market. So referring to the definition from the International Labour Organization, we can divide the population in three main groups. So the first one is the employed people. So nearly I will try in my presentation to always show the employed population in blue color. Then you have the unemployed in orange and the outside the labor force, which is the complementary group, in let's say dark orange. So first, maybe I can quickly recall you what are the ILO definitions. So for employment, what is important to take into account is that employment is defined as having worked at least 1 hour. So it's not exactly the same definition as we could have in the general sense. And in fact, unemployed people are defined like also Anna mentioned, so according to main criteria. So the unemployed people should be available to work and also actively looking for a job. And then the remaining population is called outside the labor force. So these are those people who are either not looking for a job or not available for work because, for example, they have care responsibilities. So now that I set the scene, I will go to the figures. So in terms of employment for the total population, we have more than 73% of employed people. But if we compare with the people aged 15-29, so as we consider here as the youth, you can see that the part of employed people is quite lower because of course some people are in education and not employed because they are even not working 1 hour a week, if I can simplify the situation. And as regards the unemployed people, for the total population, we have about 5%, but for the young people, we have a little bit more, so a higher percentage, 7%. So here I have to insist on the fact that the percentage are all expressed as denominator the total population, because in the previous presentation and also in general term, we express the unemployed rate as with a denominator only people employed and unemployed. We don't take people outside the labor force in the denominator. So here in my presentation, I always divide by the total population. So here it was just to mention a general picture, and then I will go more into the detail for the COVID situation. So here you have really the long-term trend. So here it's break corrected but not adjusted according to the season. So you can have some seasonal effect here in this slide, but it's just to show you the general trend since the financial crisis of 2008-9. So what we can see is that since then the employment steadily increased, while the unemployment, you can see the bar in the middle, if I can say the horizontal middle. So the part of unemployed people slightly decrease over time, but then we see clearly the shock of the COVID. And then next slide, I will show you in the three next slides really the detailed situation for the young people in terms of the COVID context. And here, as it's also important to take into account the education pattern, I have in this slide and in the two following slides divided the employment situation. Previous slide, please. I'm still in unemployment. I have divided the population in two groups. So in this case, we have in dark blue the employed young people who are not in education, and in light blue the employed people who are at the same time in education. So as I mentioned before, to be considered as employed, it it is enough to have work, for example, a couple of hours a week. So it's totally possible to combine employment and education. What we can see as regards the COVID context, we can clearly see in red that two quarters the most affected by the COVID in terms of employment is the second quarter of 2020 and the first quarter of 2021, with really a lower employment rate, especially for Q1 2021 for those who are not in education. Then we can compare the pre-COVID situation highlighted in green in Q4 2019 with the post-COVID situation. So the last data that we have using the LFS data, so Q4 2021. So we can see that the employment for the young people, those who are not in education, is not totally back to its pre-pandemic level, while people who are both in employment and in education, they have recovered their level before the COVID. So next slide. Now I present the next exercise, but for people who are unemployed. So here again, I divide the young population in two groups. So the unemployed who are not in education and the unemployed who are in education. Here we can see that the most affected quarter is Q3. So for employment, it was Q2 2020, but now for unemployment, it's Q3. So 1 quarter later, we can see that people, mostly people who are not in education, were mostly affected with a high increase in the unemployment rate. And if we compare the pre-COVID with the post-COVID situation, again, we can see some difference between people who are not in education and those who are in education. And we can see that here the decrease in unemployment is more important for the people who are not in education. Next slide, and then we have the complete picture. So the third group is the young people who are outside the labor force, so those who are not employed and not unemployed. And here we can see, in fact, both effects. So the effect of employment and the effect of unemployment here, but still with the most impact from the COVID crisis in the second quarter of 2020. And if we compare the pre-COVID to the post-COVID situation, we can see that now a bit less people are outside the labor force as concern people who are also in education, but a slight increase of people who are outside the labor force who are not in education. So one explanation for those people who are outside the labor force is that they still don't look for a job, because some of them can still think that there is not a lot of job offer for them. Then next slide, please. So maybe this can complement the previous picture, is to look at the volume of hours work for the young people. So here we look at the total volume and the evolution of the total volume, and here we can clearly see in terms of hours of work the decrease in the second quarter of 2020. Because, as also Anna mentioned, we can have in the COVID crisis some people who were still in employment, but then they did not really were working because they were in temporary layoff. So artificially, keep in employment. But still here, looking at the hours of work, we can see that clearly the young people work less in terms of hours in Q2 2020, and then it increased. Starting from Q3 2020, the number of hours increased, with a slight decrease again in the first quarter of 2021. And now in Q4 2021, we have not yet retrieved the total volume of working hours as the pre-COVID situation. And it goes in the direction that we see previously for people employed, that it is basically those who are both in employment and in education that are again working, and those who are not in education and maybe having normally a full job with more hours have not yet totally recovered the level of employment as that it was the case in the pre-COVID situation. Next slide, please. So now I will focus on the young people who are in employment, and then putting again people who are combining or not the education with the employment. So in this slide, we are interested at the difference between sex and also between the education attainment level. So here we can first compare the situation pre-COVID, so in Q4 2019 with the situation post-COVID in 2021. So maybe we can first begin with the positive message is for the red line. It's the young people with a high education level. So there they totally recover the employment level pre-COVID, because now we have 76% of young people who are employed with a high education, while the pre-COVID was a bit similar for the male, but for the female, we have even an increase. So female with high education have more chance now to be employed than it was in the pre-COVID situation. Then, unfortunately, for the people with medium or low education, the situation is not so positive, because we can see that in Q4 2021, they have not yet reached their pre-COVID level. Then we can see in the middle of the graph what were the variation really in each quarter of the COVID situation. So here we can see that for the people with higher education, it was mostly the third quarter of 2020 that was the worst, while for people with medium or low education level, they were mostly hit in Q2 2020. Next slide, please. And I have the next slide. Okay, thank you. So now look again, so as you can see with the blue color, I will focus again on the young people being in employment. And here I will divide this group of young employed people in three subgroups. The first one is the employees with a permanent contract with the darker blue. Then with the, let's say, medium blue, we have the young employees with a temporary contract. And then in light blue, the remaining group, including those without a contract, the self-employed, etc. So here, what is important to show is the share between these two groups, and to see, like also Anna mentioned, is the shock due to COVID for the young people with a temporary contract. So we can see if we compare the situation pre-COVID, especially in Q4 2019, we have nearly 16% of young people being employed with a temporary contract, and this percentage fall to 13%. And then we can see now in Q4 2021 that they hopefully have reached the pre-COVID level. And for the young people with a permanent contract, also we have a drop in Q2 2020, but with a second drop in Q1 2021. And now again, we can see that they have reached again the pre-COVID level. Next slide, please. So until now, I have presented the situation at EU level, but I would like to show you that behind this general presentation at EU level, we can see quite a lot of difference across member states. So here I will not show you the situation for all countries, but I have selected 4 countries with different patterns. So let's start with Italy and Austria. With these 2 graphs next to each other, you can clearly see that the situation can vary a lot from one country to the other. So for example, in Italy, you can see that employment mostly increased in Q3 2020, while in Austria, the employment increased mostly in Q2 2020. So basically in Italy, the employment decreased, but it was balanced in Q2 2020 with an increase of people outside the labor force. So most probably because people in Italy were even not looking for a job because maybe they had care responsibility, or they were thinking that there were no job available for them, while in Austria, it goes directly, so the decrease in employment goes directly with an increase in employment because people satisfied already at that time the 2 criteria of searching for a job and being available for a job. Now, if we go to the next slide, we can see 2 different countries here. What I would like to show is, because in all my slides, take the non-seasonally adjusted data. And it is interesting to see here between these 2 countries is the seasonal effect. So in Poland, the seasonal effect is really small, while in Finland you have a big seasonal effect because you have this graph going up and down across time. And what is also interesting to show, is that in Poland you have the effect of the COVID, which is stable between the second quarter of 2020 until the second quarter of 2021. So with a low employment rate during all this period, while in Finland you have really up and downs in the COVID during the COVID crisis. So for both these countries, the employment is not yet at its level pre-pandemic, while in the 2 first countries, in Italy and Austria, the employment was already at its level of the pre-pandemic. Maybe if I can ask to have the previous slide just to show you. So here for Italy and Austria, so if you compare what I put in green, so the level of employment in Q4 2021, so for Italy it was 32%. You can see that is higher than the pre-pandemic level, and also the same in Austria, while in next slide, please, you can see here in red, in Poland and Finland, the employment level is not yet at this level pre-pandemic. And so now I will finish next slide, please, with a small map at EU level, so to show also the disparities across regions. So I explained in the 2 previous slides the disparities across countries, but you have also disparities across regions, what is clearly visible in these maps. So the young employment rate varies a lot inside some countries across regions. And then next slide. So here, if you are interested to know more about all this, I can refer you a publication in Statistic Explained, so one from yesterday, called Employment Annual Statistics, and one of this morning, Unemployment at Regional Level. And we have also an online publication with 6 detailed articles in this online publication called Labour Market in the Light of the COVID Pandemic, Quarterly Statistics. And if you want to have really a set of data to play with, I recommend you to go on our website and to go in this labor market section, and here you have all the data for your further analysis. So thank you very much, and we are now there for your questions.
Thank you, Fabienne. So now I'm going to welcome back Didier and Hannah to form a Q&A panel. I'll present them with the questions and hopefully they'll present some answers. So we have a number of questions already. So question 1, how many persons were in short-term schemes and how many worked overtime? I don't know, do we have some figures on short-term schemes and overtime? I mean, I know Hannah presented some data on short-term contracts, non-permanent contracts.
Maybe I can answer this question. So it's true that we have some figures to show. So first, in our presentation, so in the presentation of Anna, she explained the situation as regard about temporary contract for people aged 20-64. In my presentation, I show you the situation for the young people, and to complement, we have prepared this slide for you. So here you can see the repartition of for each country of people according to the number of hours they work weekly. So as you can see also here, you have big variation across country. But if you look at EU level, we can see that still you have a big differences. So you have nearly 20% who are working less than 35 hours a week. Then you have 2 small groups. So for people working between 35 and 38 hours a week, and also people working 38 until 40 hours a week. But then you have the majority of people at EU level working between 42 and 45 hours a week. And then you have really a small number of people working between 42 and 45 hours a week.
Thank you, Fabienne. And then we have a second question, which I think is also for Fabienne, which is about rates amongst immigrants. How were employment rates affected amongst immigrants during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, so here also we have some data to show. So here you can see the employment rate by citizenship, where we have made 3 groups. So the first group is what we call reporting country, is that when the person has the same citizenship as her country of residence. Then the second group is then when the person has the citizenship of another EU 27 member states, and the first group in red is when the person has the citizenship of a country outside the EU. And what we can clearly see with these 3 lines is that people having a citizenship from outside the EU have an employment rate quite lower than the 2 other groups. With the COVID, the 3 groups were more or less affected the same way in the second quarter of 2020, but people having citizenship from outside the EU were a bit more affected in Q1 2021 in the second time. What can be also see is that people with citizenship from a country outside the EU have recovered their level pre-pandemic.
Thank you, Fabienne. I think now, if I'm not mistaken, we have a couple of questions for Hannah. The first one is, can you show the occupations employed?
All right, we should have a slide for that as well. We do have information on occupations. In order to show them, they have to be aggregated quite a bit. So in this standard classification, the groups are really broad. We have on the left-hand side managers, then professionals, technicians and associate professionals, clerical support workers, and then all the way down, I think you can all hopefully read it for yourself. We have elementary occupations and then a very small share for the armed forces occupations. The color codes are yellow for the 2019 share of total employment, blue for the 2020 shares, and 2021 is orange. But please note, so far we've mainly seen break-corrected series. Here in this case, we have to be very careful in comparing the data. These are not break-corrected. What we can see, nevertheless, is that there seems to be the situation seems to be relatively stable. We cannot say there has been a major impact in 2020. If we look at the picture like this, there are small developments, but on the yearly averages, it looks like there has been no disturbance from COVID on the distribution of occupational groups on that aggregate level. Of course, we all know there was a big discussion on occupations which were very important during the lockdowns. For this, we would have to go into much more detail and to look at the data by country. But overall, we can say that right now there has been no major development in the last couple of years.
Thank you, Hannah. And then there's another question which I think you're going to tackle, which is this year a good moment for starting a new job? I mean, firstly, I must say that Eurostat can't offer careers advice, other than if you're a statistician, consider us. But I think Hannah does have some interesting data that throws a light on starting jobs.
Yes, let's try to answer that one. This one is actually not that relevant, but I'll show it to you anyway, because what was one of the very remarkable effects is that we had major absences from work during COVID. And what we can say, even though we have a break in the data, is that this has leveled off. So right now, again, together with all the other data we've seen, we can say we're basically back to pre-COVID labor markets right now. Of course, it depends on where you are, how old you are, what your education is, and so forth. On the next slide, what we can see is how many people started a job recently. And recently in this case means in the last 3 months. And what we see is that also there we are at a high level, even higher than before COVID. So it seems like a good, on average, like a good point in time to go apply for jobs. People do find jobs and start new jobs. And again, we see nicely this COVID effect of really a stop in hiring, a stop of job starters in the second quarter of Q2. But again, right now, labor markets look relatively strong again. And finally, there should be another slide with country data. So of course, it depends a lot on where you are. Before, we already saw in Fabienne's presentation, situations and countries are very different. Of course, we've been talking about EU averages mainly. If you are in the Netherlands, in Sweden, in Czechia, it's probably a good bet that you'll find a job. Employment rates are very high to begin with. We see the orange dot that there has been a positive development between 2020 and 21 in the employment rate. But even if you're in a country with lower employment rates at the other end of the spectrum, in Italy, Greece, Spain, we see that there has been very, very large progress. So the increases in the employment rates have been massive. In fact, we don't have a single country well, we have one single country where there has been a decrease in the employment rate between 2020 and 21, which is Latvia. But in all other countries, the labor market is strong. And yeah, again, of course, it depends a lot on your specific situation, your age, occupation, and so forth, on whether you will actually find a job. So that's as far as I would like to answer that question.
Thank you very much, Hannah. I think we have a question for Fabienne now, which is it possible to give some advice where I can find data for platform economy, gig economy workers at EU level and by country, and with a particular focus on Greece? So, Fabienne, where can we find this data?
Yes, unfortunately, these data are not yet available, but they are being collected. So we, given the importance of the topic, we set up a specific data collection that is going on for the whole year 2022. So in all countries that were willing to do this data collection, so we have 18 countries participating in this pilot data collection, and we will have the data in the middle of 2023. So we are looking forward to receive this data.
Thank you, Fabienne. And I think the next one, I believe, is for Hannah, which is, how is a traineeship considered for statistical purposes? Are youth performing traineeships considered NEET, that is not in employment or training? Or how are they counted, Hannah?
All right. So generally, traineeships can be part of your formal education, which would mean in any case you'd be in education and certainly not NEET. Or it can be without that link, so as a part of your non-formal education. But what we're really looking at is whether you're getting paid for that traineeship or not. So if you get paid, you're being counted as employed, and if that payment is linked to the traineeship specifically. So if you have a, let's say, a grant for your education and the traineeship is part of your education, but you don't get a specific salary for your traineeship, you're still not counted as employed, even though you received that grant, but it's linked to the schooling. But if you have a small salary linked to the traineeship, you're always counted as employed. So only in a case where the traineeship is not within formal training and is not paid, then you would be counted as NEET. But it really depends on the payment linked to the traineeship specifically.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. We're coming to the end of our time. We do have one more question, but we've taken a look at it and we think it's a more complex question that would require us to actually dig into the database briefly. So we're the question was about employment, unemployment in the IT sector and how it varied before, through and after COVID. So there we're going to put up a link to our user support, I think, on Slido. Anna Maria and Suzanne, who are our background experts running Slido for us, we'll put the link up to user support, and we'll invite the person asking that question to contact user support, because we will need to take a look in the database. So we don't have that data to hand immediately. Before we finish, I'm going to do a little bit more housekeeping. So the first thing to say is that on Slido, we will run a short satisfaction survey, which we'd be very pleased if you would fill in. Also, we intend to put up as I say, the recording of this webinar plus the slides, the presentations we made. We'll make them available through our website. On our page for the webinar, and you can go and sort of download and look at the presentations in detail. We put our user support details in Slido, so if you have further questions, please feel free to direct them to user support, and they'll be happy to see what they can do for you. So with that being said, I think it only remains for me to say thank you to our three panelists, to Didier, the head of unit, to Fabienne, the team leader, and to Hannah, the statistical officer, who I hope have helped to answer some of the questions you might have about the labour market and what's been happening to it over the last, particularly the last year, but over the last 2 years as well, with the impact of COVID, and with also how it's particularly affected young people. So a very big thank you to the three of you. And thank you to all of you who listened, who watched, and who asked questions. And we hope to see you again when we do our next webinar, whenever that may be. I'm not sure if we've set the date yet or the subject, but we will be back. Also, one last thing I will say, as well as webinars, we've also launched into the world of podcasting. So if you do have an interest in statistics, I would invite you to go to your favourite pod device, podcasting app, and look for Stats in a Wrap from Eurostat. The first podcast on tourism statistics is out now, and the second podcast, which is on waste statistics, is in editing at the moment and should be released within a week or two. I think that's the last thing I'd like to say. So I would just say once more, thank you to Didier, Hannah, Fabienne.